Chetter Galloway, and I'm a professional storyteller here in the greater Atlanta area. Currently, I reside in Decatur, Georgia. Have been in Atlanta for over 2 years and actually moved here from South Carolina, where I was working at a museum, and moved here to pursue profession of storytelling and have been doing so since. It's been about 1.5 years now. I started back in January of 2019, but I've known about the Wren's Nest since I moved here back in '97. I was working at the Atlanta History Center at that time, and they have an exhibit about the Brer Rabbit stories. At the History Center, I was a museum guide. We used to take school groups around to the different the living history exhibits, and the Swan House, the Tully Smith Farm, and the Quarry Garden to educate them about Atlanta history. And also the inside of the museum too was part of the tour. And at one of the stops, there was an exhibit on the Brer Rabbit stories, and there was an African-American storyteller. Her voice was recorded, I believe it was from the 30s or 40s, somewhere in that time frame. I don't quite remember now, but she was telling, of course, the most famous Brer Rabbit story, which was the Brer Rabbit and the Tar Baby. Well, I have a bachelor's degree in history, and I've pursued a career in museums when I was living in South Carolina. And I was introduced to a storyteller who's no longer with us at one of her workshops. Her name was Jackie Torrance, and she was known for telling Jack tales and plenty of the Brer Rabbit stories. And that was probably my first official introduction to the stories at that point. Of course, we'd known about the Brer Rabbit stories through the Song of the South movie, but had not really, outside of that, didn't know about them in detail at all until meeting with Jackie Torrance at her workshop and becoming more involved, engaged in learning more stories. In Virginia, there's my hometown is Suffolk, Virginia. It's near Norfolk, Portsmouth, Virginia Beach, and the Hampton Roads area, and lived there before after I graduated from high school. We moved to Williamsburg, Virginia, which is still in the same area, but just about an hour away. I always knew about stories, however, didn't really encounter them until a little later. Growing up, like I said, encountered them until I became into the museum profession, and that came into play after I graduated college. Stories. The way I was introduced to them, the first impression of the stories, I don't want to say was positive, but I knew they were part of folklore and a part of history. Like at that point, I hadn't seen the Uncle Remus books or many of the characters or caricatures of him telling those stories. So my first impression was, again, through another storyteller. I don't want to say they were sanitized, but I just knew the way I was introduced, they were part of our history and culture. And as you get more into your profession and more into storytelling and more in depth, you discover other things about the stories, about how they have been misrepresented or misinterpreted over the years due to time. Actually, the most popular story that me know is Brer Rabbit and the Tar Baby, of course. And I do recall growing up, if we wanted to make fun of someone, we call them you're just an old tar baby. How children can be cruel. So for many years, I wouldn't, when I first learned about the stories, two reasons I wouldn't tell it. One was that, and the other reason is so many other folks tell the story, and it's told so often. Now that, which can be both a good thing as well as, been overplayed, overtold too much. What I have, a story that is very similar to it that I tell in its place, and I reference Brer Rabbit and the Tar Baby story, is it's called The Turtle of Coca, and it's very similar where I liken it to Brer Rabbit saying, "Please don't put me in a briar patch." The turtle saying, "Please don't put me back in the water." And we both know that turtles can live in the water, and Brer Rabbit, of course, lives in the briar patch. When I introduced the stories to children when I was on the young audience roster, that's one way I would show them how stories travel, how they have their origin, how they change over culture and over time for various needs and settings. Some of them, not a whole lot in detail. The language is, it does take time to adjust, our modern day language to interpret a lot of the words and meanings that are conveyed in the language he's captured them in. Some of them people would consider rich in history by a comparison today. Others, would have a different take on them and consider them, fairly, might consider them offensive or not needing to be reshared again today. Or if they're going to be reshared, they have to be some kind of adjustment to the terms or adjustment to the wording to make them palatable for an audience today. Actually, when I was first introduced to these stories, Julius Lester has 2 books out, I believe, at the time when I was introduced to them. So, in terms of that language, the language was was different when I came into it. It had been updated to that point, which was like in the mid 1990s that I first started. So. Yeah. Favorite now, speaking of telling stories all the time, telling a story all the time, probably my favorite by far is Brer Rabbit Builds a Home. The animals live outside, they need a place to stay, so they get together and suggest building a house. Everybody has to have a job to build a house except for, of course, Brer Rabbit. He's just sitting around doing nothing, and they say, if you're gonna live here, you have to find something to do. So he finds every excuse not to find something to do, and but then he finds one thing to do that just basically is measuring and marking. And after the house is built, he makes enough commotion to run everybody out in the house. And when the house is clear, he stays there and lives there till now. In that story. And I've been telling it for 20 years, and it's still going strong. There's so many elements that you can change and adjust and make it applicable to people, whether they're young children or adults like us. And that's primarily because he in that story, I think he encompasses the characters and elements and essence of a human being more than anything, because we all work with someone like that. We go to church with someone like him in this story. And of course, we may be living with someone like him in the story, constantly plotting and planning to do something to make things better for themselves as opposed to the people around him. And the reason I think the story works for me so much is whatever city I'm in, I always say you can go down the road and see this great big house in such and such city, whether it's Marietta, Kennesaw, or Decatur, or anywhere. And sometimes the looks on people's faces after you've told the story, they're like, well, where is this house? And that's, that's storytelling gold there, because you gotten them hooked into thinking about this, I guess we call, what they call in the movie, suspension of disbelief, that there's this gigantic house 5 stories high and 10 blocks wide just down the street from where they live. So it works probably best. And I use it as a foundation story to attach all the other stories I may share about Brer Rabbit. He's always in that house, in that briar patch, and that's sort of like a starting point for the other stories. You know, that's a way of connecting the, making that link between modern day and making that connection in history between modern day and yesterday. And another one of the stories, I say he needs his workout music, so he calls on Alexa, Siri, and Google Voice to, you know, simultaneously play his workout music so he can get prepared for his next set of trickery in the story. It was interesting. One audience member, she came in and she said she didn't know what to expect. However, they stayed the entire program. I'm not sure what they were expecting in terms of the program, if it was going to be something negative, I guess, for lack of a better word. But by the end of the program, they said we just didn't know what to expect, but they were curious enough to check things out, and they stayed for the rest of the house museum. And then there was another occasion. One of the audience members, he was I forgot some physical condition or his medical condition, I guess I should say. However, by the end of the program, he showed me an iPad. And he showed me an iPad to let me know he understood the stories, and he appreciated the program and being there. I think he had a communication challenge, right, but he still was able to interpret these stories and get the gist of all of them. And you could tell by the reaction, but it was very refreshing to know that afterwards that the stories made an impact on him. Occasionally, I'll perform some African folk tales, like many tellers have Anansi stories in their repertoire that they'll tell. And there are actually some animal rabbit stories from Africa that I think many of the Brer Rabbit stories can probably be traced to. One I share at the Wren's Nest is how the rabbit comes the king's advisor, and does similar trickery as Brer Rabbit would do to gain that role. On occasion, I'll tell some personal stories about growing up in Virginia, or things I experienced over the years in storytelling. Like, for example, one of my most interesting storytelling experiences was telling in a cave, and we were telling ghost stories. And lo and behold, in the middle of a story, bats come flying through the cave. So we had to adjust. We had to move to a different setting. But they thought, most of the people, they weren't afraid. You know, they knew we had to move to a different area. However, they were even more engaged after us having to move from the cave. I'm serving 2 roles, actually, which is okay. I'm the vice president and secretary of KUUMBA Storytellers of Georgia, which was founded in 1995, and this year we'll be celebrating 25 years of the organization. But all the Ramblers at the Wren's Nest are members, and Akbar and Akbar Imhotep and Gwendolyn Napier both have served as president of the organization over the years, and in other capacities on the board as well. And we share stories in the community. We do things in the community. One of our programs last year was a breast cancer awareness storytelling program. We also worked with summer reading, programs at libraries, and have been part of the mayor's summer reading program last year as well. And we also have a youth organization called the Tattletales, who also perform at our various programs. And I have performed nationally at festivals. Most recently, a couple of weeks ago at the National Storyteller Network, they were part of the virtual storytelling conference, 3 of our youth storytellers. KUUMBA is a Swahili word. It is it is the 6th principle of Kwanzaa, and it means creativity. And we have many creative people. Some in our organization, some are storytellers. I don't want to say only, some outside of storytelling, I guess they are puppeteers or in acting, or some sing as well. So it encompasses, the name encompasses a lot of the individuals who are in our group. With anything in history, you have to dig deep and do your research and understand where these stories originated and how over time the interpretation of the stories and the use of the stories and application of the stories have gone in directions based off people's either intentions or unintentionally in the wrong place. And the perception of it have been received negatively, in spite of people trying to, like us, trying to preserve the history and folklore about these African American tales. It's the perception does get skewed in all of that. Remember where they came from, and even with that, some still will raise an eyebrow at the stories or wonder why we're still sharing the stories. However, I would encourage you to look at the stories again, or find a version of the story that will help you understand where they came from and why they're still being told to this day. Glad to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.